Good afternoon. I am Louisa Jenkin, a Senior Portfolio Manager within the Bioscience for an Integrated Understanding of Health sector at the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, part of UK Research and Innovation. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of BBSRC to our UN Food Systems Summit Independent Dialogue event today. Bioscience for Sustainable Agriculture and Food and Bioscience for an Integrated Understanding of Health are two of BBSRC's strategic priority areas, and the challenge of understanding and integrating research across agriculture, food production and processing, nutrition, and the impact on health to be able to sustainably provide safe, nutritious, and healthy food that is accessible for all and is sensitive to environmental impact is a key priority for BBSRC. I'm pleased to introduce our chair for today, Professor Guy Poppy. Guy is Interim Associate Vice President of Interdisciplinary Research at the University of Southampton and the Director of the UK Transforming UK Food Systems for Healthy People and a Healthy Planet programme. This programme is a 47 million Strategic Priorities Fund programme. Over to you, Guy.
Well, thank you, Louisa, and welcome everybody to what hopefully will be a really fascinating afternoon. I think everybody joining this meeting will know that the vital role that research and innovation plays in addressing big challenges. We're all living through one of the biggest challenges that there's been for over 100 years. And it's research and innovation that's driving our way out of that, how we recover from that, and how, even to the extent of how we're vaccinating people to enable us to kind of start building back a better and a more resilient future. And as Louisa has said, UKRI is the biggest funder of research in the United Kingdom, and it covers the breadth of activities from the social sciences, the arts and humanities, across to the biological and medical and engineering and physical sciences. When it comes to addressing the food system, and which we're going to be discussing today, it is bringing together those disciplines right across from the kind of the social through to the kind of physical and natural sciences, which is absolutely necessary. The biological the BBSRC is the research council which is hosting this workshop, and as Louisa has kind of mentioned, it works on a whole range of issues, whether it be the more production end of things in terms of agriculture, livestock, a whole range of sort of how we maximize and optimize agriculture and make it more resilient, but also covers the sort of more nutrition and health side of the food system. So it's well placed to be the research council which leads on this discussion we're going to have today, which is feeding into the United Nations Food Systems Summit. I'm really pleased that the United Nations have decided to kind of put a summit together on food systems. I mean, it doesn't seem that long ago that the kind of people were beginning to get familiar with the concept of food security, and food security wasn't just providing calories, it required a lot more than that. And it's really pleasing to see the recognition that actually to get food security, you need to consider this complex system that is the food system. In fact, it's so diverse and addressing it is so important that when it comes to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, if you get the food system right, you address either directly or indirectly the majority of those goals. And that's what this United Nations Food Systems Summit is about addressing the whole system by targeting these particular actions. And we're taking part in one of the dialogues here, which is feeding into the pre-summit conversations which will be convened from Rome, and then ultimately into the Food Systems Summit, which is going to be hosted in New York in September. As most of you on the call will be aware, that one of the things that COVID has really highlighted is some of the fragility of the food system and how it's currently structured, whether that be disruptions in the supply chain, whether it be people who are most vulnerable to either getting COVID in the first place and or suffering most from COVID once they are infected. And the National Food Strategy in the UK is also beginning to unpack the kind of inequalities. I remember speaking to Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty very early on in the COVID pandemic, and one of the things they said that was apparent from the very, very early days was it really shone a light on health inequalities. And I think health inequalities links very much into the food system debate, and many of those inequalities kind of shine through in terms of whether it be to do with non-communicable diseases, whether it be to do with sort of long-term health and well-being throughout somebody's life, and the concept of the first 1,000 days, and in terms of getting nutrition right in those first 1,000 days has long-term health consequences on an individual. One of the other things that we want to bring out here, in fact, when food security is defined, it's often talked about in terms of the fourth pillar of that being associated with the kind of the stability and the resilience of the system. So in your discussions today, we need to obviously be thinking about what we're discussing in terms of how we can make that more stable and more resilient, because there's no point in a sort of a tragedy of the commons type sense in terms of solving a problem today if only you make the problem worse tomorrow. And so what I'd like everybody to do during the course of this afternoon is, on listening to the presentations and then when taking part in the discussions and the breakout groups, we're trying to focus in here in terms of how research and innovation can help. So I want you to constantly be thinking about, what sort of research can we do to kind of address these big challenges? What sort of innovation is then needed to be actually translate that research into something which is going to have impact? And what sort of solutions might we propose which can be tested and introduced and in a sort of a policy cycle which can kind of contribute to this problem? Because I think many people talk about grand challenges, and maybe many people talk about whether it be COVID or climate change as big grand challenges. My premise is that the food system is linked to nearly all the grand challenges facing society, and you might argue it's the biggest challenge of all. And therefore, I think this is a call to arms. This United Nations Food Systems Summit is a call to arms for us to really do something now before it's too late to actually change the food system so that we have a healthier planet and a healthier people. Because actually, if we don't have a healthy planet, you can't have healthy people. And if you don't have healthy people, then you're unlikely to have a healthy planet, at least in terms of the role that man plays in that. So I wish you a really productive and interesting afternoon, and I'm very conscious that I've nearly spoken for too long, and I know Louisa wants me to stick to time, so I'm going to now pass over to the first speaker today, who's Professor Judy Buttriss, who's going to address the question of what is a healthy nutrition diet for population and planetary health. I don't think Judith needs any introduction to the community that's here today, but she's the Director General of the British Nutrition Foundation, been an important voice in the debate of the role that nutrition plays in society, and I've certainly over the years really appreciated Judy and her kind of contributions, and very early recognised as well the role of food systems on all of this. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Judy. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you put the next slide on, please? So thank you very much. So the big question really is, how can we feed a growing population while reducing malnutrition? And by that, I mean both undernutrition and also overnutrition in terms of excess calories. And at the same time, tackle the environmental effects of our current food system. And all of this in the context of a growing global population, probably an increased demand for animal-based foods as populations become more prosperous, etc. So next slide, please. So, we're going to have to acknowledge that there's going to be trade-offs and personal preferences. Can you put the next slide on, please? Personal preferences and affordability and convenience will be driving dietary choices. And these need to be balanced against environmental impact. And by this, I don't just mean greenhouse gas emissions, but all of the factors that contribute to a more sustainable food supply. But nutritional quality, the ability to meet nutrient requirements, is also of fundamental importance for human health, as Guy has already said. And for me, that's non-negotiable. In the UK, we have food-based dietary guidelines in the form of the Eat Well Guide. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a big chunk of this is devoted to fruit and veg, another big chunk to cereal foods. And there are also some plant-based ingredients within the other two sectors at the bottom there. So this is a predominantly plant-based diet. Next slide, please. And studies have already indicated that shifting towards the diet shown in the Eat Well Guide reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 30% compared with low compliance, and that's a recent study published in 2020. And the panel on the left just illustrates that there are a number of different ways in which diets can be adjusted in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that it's not a requirement that we all become vegans in order to get some benefit. And so the Eat Well Guide is clearly a good place to start. Next slide, please. So with the growing interest in plant-based eating, certainly in the UK, just before Christmas, we did a survey with YouGov to find out what the public perceive a plant-based diet to be. And we were quite surprised to find that 41% of people perceived it to be a vegan diet and a further 20% to be a vegetarian diet. Now, in the UK, these sorts of dietary patterns are not particularly common, particularly vegan diets. So it does beg the question whether confusion about what a plant-based diet is could be limiting people's desire to shift towards the more plant-based type of diet depicted in food-based dietary guidelines here in the UK and in many other countries. Next slide, please. So this plant-based trend has become quite a rapidly developing one, but most of the focus has been around alternative sources of protein. And there has been, in some instances, conventional ingredients, pulses, nuts, grains have been the focus, and extracts from these, but spanning right across to very much more novel foods, algae, cultured meat, and insects. And I'd argue that there are a number of considerations that need to be in place when deciding which types of protein alternatives to focus on if we're to be considering reducing the more conventional sort of animal proteins that most of us consume currently. The first point is whether a health halo that's sometimes associated with these foods is justified if they also, as well as being plant-derived, have a lot of fat or salt in them. Another consideration is the quality of the protein, and in particular the amino acid profile within those proteins. Also important is the overall nutrient profile or nutrient density. It's not just about protein, because animal sources of protein usually have lots of other nutrients present with them. One particular advantage of eating more plant-derived foods is the opportunity to get more fibre into the diet. Most of us don't get enough fibre, certainly in this country. But another issue is whether or not there are anti-nutritional factors present in the foods. So phytate and oxalate, for example, can actually inhibit absorption of nutrients by binding onto the minerals in the gut. Another factor is the overall environmental footprint of foods across the multiple domains of sustainability, so not just greenhouse gas emissions. And then there are other factors around flavour, texture, functionality, and of course cost. And for some people, the presence of a clean label, i.e. a short ingredients list with a limited number of processing ingredients, is also an important factor. Next slide, please. Here I've just, previous one. Here I've just given you a bit of a few examples of the protein concentration in different foods. So at the top there in the sort of pinky box, we've got beef, chicken and eggs, and you can see there's a lot of protein there. But other sources of protein are listed below in blue, the vegetable sources or plant sources. And you can see that there's still good opportunities to get plenty of protein from those foods, although generally, in most cases, lower amounts than in meat. But one of the things we need to consider with the animal sources of protein is that that protein is coming packaged with a number of other nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and in particular vitamin B12, which plants don't normally provide. So they have a good overall nutrient profile. And in terms of the protein, all of the essential amino acids are present. And the bioavailability of the micronutrients, particularly the minerals, tends to be good. By contrast, the plant sources of protein typically have at least one of the essential amino acids present in a relatively low concentration, although of course this can easily be overcome by combining two protein sources together, as typically happens in many cuisines around the world, so lentils with rice or beans with wheat, for example, in South America. So the big point I wanted to emphasize here is the importance of understanding the bioaccessibility and the bioavailability of the micronutrients that are present in plant sources. When we use food composition tables, we get a value that tells us the total amount of calcium or iron or zinc in a food. It doesn't give us a sense of the bioavailability of that source of that nutrient. And I think this is a real area where we need more information, particularly as we are including different types of plant foods in our diets, which are not necessarily featuring in the food composition databases. Next slide, please. Now here, if you focus on the middle panel with the red border, I've just given you a sense, this is data for teenagers as it happens, but the numbers are very similar for adults in the UK, to show the percentage of a range of different nutrients listed on the left, so iron, calcium, zinc, etc., that we currently get from animal source proteins, so meat, milk, eggs, and fish. And you can see that we get, for example, over half of our zinc from those foods, predominantly from meat, but also from milk. We get 2/3 of our iodine, predominantly from milk. So if we are to shift towards a diet that has less animal protein and more plant-based ingredients, it's really important that we think about sources of for these nutrients, and also ideally bioavailable sources. And this is particularly important for those groups of the population that already have indication of relatively poor diets. And probably the worst group in the UK is adolescents, particularly girls. And in the orange panel on the right, I've indicated the proportion of that age group in the National Diet and Nutrition Survey here in the UK that have an intake of those nutrients below the lower reference nutrient intake. And this is an amount that's only regarded as sufficient for those with the lowest requirements within that population. So you'd all normally expect quite low numbers, less than 2.5%. in that column, but you can see there's some really quite big numbers there. And if these levels of intake were to persist over a period of time, then that might signal that these diets were inadequate. Next slide, please. And this isn't a particularly new phenomenon. We know from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey that intakes of these particular vitamins and minerals have been falling over the past decade. And they're also falling in the younger age group, 4 to 10-year-olds, although at the moment the absolute levels are not of concern in the same way as they are in the adolescents. Next slide, please.
Judy, you've used 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll skip the next slide then and just very quickly show you the summary slide. So this is just some of the key points really. Overall dietary quality is really important. And the slide I've just skipped over was suggesting that when we're assessing the environmental impact of foods, we should really be taking more account of nutritional quality. So instead of expressing carbon in terms of per 100 grams of food, incorporating some sort of nutritional index to get a sense of the nutritional quality. And I'll leave it there, Guy. Just the last slide, if we just leave that up, is just some of the research gaps and uncertainties that I've tried to flag as I've gone through this very, very quick talk. Sorry for going over.
Thank you. So hopefully we can get the last slide to people, during the breakouts and that as well. So we've got something to kind of help structure the discussion. So thank you. That moves us to the second presentation, which is focused on how we can improve linkages between agriculture and health research to produce an affordable, accessible, and nutritious diet for all that is sustainable in a changing environment. That's quite a big question there. But and we have Dr. Nafis Mir, who is going to introduce this topic to us. For those, Nafis has had a very diverse career. He's worked in a range of organisations. In fact, currently works for one of the big international research organisations, the International Rice Research Institute, but has also worked in the research councils and in DEFRA. As well, so a very diverse background in terms of research councils, big international organisations, and the principal UK government department looking after all of this. So a great kind of track record to talk about this topic. Over to you, Nafis.
Great, thank you very much for that, Guy. Shall we move to the first slide? I'll give an outline. So my topic is about the linkage, improving the linkage between agriculture and health. Now, what I'm going to do is use South Asia as a illustration. And that's partly because I'm based in South Asia. I'm the IRI South Asia representative. So what I want to run through in the next 10 minutes or so is 4 areas. The green revolution in South Asia and its impact. First of all, what's now known as the triple burden, which is affecting more and more countries in South Asia, and linked to that, the consensus now on the negative externalities that we see in the existing food system. And lastly, about the linkage, the research for development linkage between agriculture and health. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of a background, the South Asia region comprises of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. 1.75 billion people and increasing, and its GDP in 2019, pre-COVID, was about 3.5 trillion USD. So quite a substantial number of people and a substantially sized economy. And of course, over the last 30 years in particular, the area has seen rapid economic growth. Next slide, please. So most of you will be familiar with the Green Revolution. And essentially what it did was help transform South Asia from an area of chronic food deficit. So you had the expression ship to mouth in India, reliant very much on food aid from the US in the 1960s, to a situation now where, despite a substantial increase in population, there is a food surplus in the region, and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. Next slide, please. And if you think about India in particular, it's made phenomenal progress in production of food commodities. And this table here just gives you an example. A huge increase in food grain, that's wheat principally, and rice. And it's in fact surplus in most, if not all, commodities. It's also, surprisingly for many people, the second biggest producer of fruits and vegetables after China. Next slide, please. And if you take Bangladesh as another example, you can see here on the chart that the production of rice is essentially quadrupled over the last 40 years or so. A lot of that is thanks, plug for my organization, IRI, where currently 80% of high yield varieties that are planted in Bangladesh were derived from IRI germplasm. Next slide, please. And yet, of course, the system is failing, and these are just some of the indicators that we could talk about. So in India, 45% of children 4 to 5 years old in several states are stunted. Similar number in Bangladesh are zinc deficient. 21% in Bangladesh are vitamin A deficient, which leads to blindness in many women of reproductive age, not just in Nepal, but across the region, are anemic. And of course, more recently, we've got this massive increase in diabetes. So there is an issue with notwithstanding the success of the Green Revolution with the food system. If we move to the next slide. And just move two spaces. And again, thank you. And you can see, back please. Yeah, you can see here from the global index score that's produced by Concern Worldwide and Welter Hunger Health in Germany. And this score is based on under 5 mortality rate, prevalence of wasting, prevalence of stunting in children, and proportion of undernourished. In South Asia, notwithstanding the progress made in economic development, the score, the global hunger index score, is surprisingly lower than, worse than sub-Saharan Africa. So there is, notwithstanding the progress, as I said, that has been made, a problem with the food system. And if we go to the next slide, we have what is now recognized as the triple burden. Not only do we have undernutrition, so in India, 14% of the adult population does not get enough calories. We also have micronutrient deficiency and increasingly obesity and overweight that's giving rise to non-communicable diseases. So one of the things that we need to be concerned with is in the dietary transition, which we might expect in South Asia, to avoid the same trajectory that's happened in developed countries and those countries which are on the path to development, where you see increase in obesity and overweight. Next slide, please. And if you just well, one click further. So when we think about the SDGs and SDG 2 in particular, on zero hunger and ensuring that people have access to safe nutritious and sufficient food all year round, well, it's clearly the case that in South Asia, meeting the SDGs is going to be a big challenge, number of reasons, not least rising population. Soil degradation is becoming an increasing problem across the region. Climate change, of course, and its impacts. And of course, agricultural policies that have up to now ignored the negative externalities, not only on nutrition, but also on preserving and extending natural capital. And of course, over the last 2 years or so, COVID-19 pandemic has set the whole region back, largely because not so much the agriculture system per se, but the loss of income of many, many people. Next slide, please. So we need a food system transformation. It's become absolutely essential, and it's needed for a number of things. First, enabling access to nutritious and healthy food. And I said India, for example, is the second largest producer of fruit and vegetables, a lot of which goes to waste. There's a huge amount that doesn't reach the table. And you need a transformation to guarantee sustainable food production, processing and retail, climate change, and importantly, improving livelihoods of smallholder farmers, as 80% of farmers, 80% of food in South Asia is produced by smallholder farmers, and that is farmers with less than 2 hectares of land. Next slide, please. So when we think about it, there's been a huge amount of work done in recent years on conceptual pathways between agriculture and nutrition. And some of you will know about the work that was funded by DFID called LANSA, Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia. And it identified a number of pathways through which you could link agriculture and nutrition. 3 broad ones. One was around increasing food production for own consumption. Second one was around increasing agricultural income. And third was around empowering women and recognizing the importance of women in many of these societies in developing countries. If you empowered women, you had a greater chance of increasing the maternal nutrition, but also substantially improving child nutrition. Next slide, please.
10 minutes now, Navis.
Okay. So some of the things that we're doing at IRI include diversification of rice-based system, increasing agricultural productivity, empowering women farmers and rural entrepreneurs, whole piece of work on biofortification. But that on its own isn't enough. You need to improve nutritional knowledge and awareness. And finally, this has all got to be linked to WASH and improving food safety. If I could just go to the last slide, please. You just go forward, next. Next. Thank you. So I think the challenge really is this. We need R&D that enables us to sustainably deliver affordable and nutritious meals every day for everyone. So that's the challenge. It's easily articulated, but very, very difficult to do. And partly that is because of the institutional arrangements that exist in many countries and the need for a number of different sectors in government, in the private sector, etc., to come together to be able to deliver that. But that, I think, encapsulates our challenge. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nafis. So that brings us to the last of the major questions or themes that we're going to be discussing today is what is the role of research and innovation in improving the nutrition? We've heard a lot about nutrition so far, and I think it actually is an area which has been neglected in a lot of the discourse and debate that's been going on. So how can research and innovation improve the nutrition quality of food in a changing environment? And to talk through that is Simon Griffiths, who's a group leader at the John Innes Centre, one of the premier plant microbial research institutes in the country, funded through BBSRC and winning money from other places too. And Simon, over to you to introduce the topic.
Sorry, I was muted.
Simon, you're muted.
Move the slide ahead, please. Thanks. So this is my triple burden slide, and it's describing the problem that we have in development of future agricultural systems, where we do absolutely need to increase productivity. And you can see on the 9 billion to feed slide that that's the population growth that we've got to deal with. And for example, in wheat, the area I work in, every year is a year of record production. And for that to continue, we need increased investment in those calories for the staple, for the maintenance of the global population. But of course, just as been said, you can't do that on its own. We still face the old enemies of malnutrition, stunting, wasting, and kind of new plagues of obesity and diabetes. So in terms of using research to tackle those problems, what have we got to do? Next slide, please. On top of that, the sands are shifting under our feet in terms of climate change. So if we look at the effects of climate change in terms of nutrition, one important thing is that generally climate change equals crop change, and usually that means less diversity in farming systems. So I'm showing there a high resolution map of rotation within the UK agricultural system. And in recent years, we have seen the viability of certain crops dropping to such an extent that they're removed from the UK crop rotation. And of course, globally, that means less diversity in agriculture, and so less diversity in our diet. Also, we see as a future trend the shift away from meat and dairy, and that means changes in breeding targets. So although on the face of it, as this slide from Eschel et al. Shows that on the whole, a plant-based diet is, on the face of it, it's going to more than easily replace the nutrients that we have in a diet that includes meat consumption. But it's going to change the nutrient profile of what we're breeding for in terms of nutrient availability, the balance of different nutrients in those foods. So they're really interesting questions for fundamental plant science and breeding. Finally, alongside climate change, we're going to have to farm with less water and less fertilizer. The map shows the ever-dropping water table of the Punjab, the breadbasket of India. This is clearly, it's almost the definition of unsustainability. And we have to be breeding crops where we're producing the same for less in terms of inputs. And of course, that's going to have impacts on the nutrient content of that food. Next slide, please. Okay, so often when you say these things, what have you got to do? People talk about it as if it's one or the other. Crops have to be high yielding or they have to be nutritious. I want to make the argument today that actually the reason you often see these kind of nutrient dilution effects, etc., is because the selection pressure in breeding is only for yield. And in fact, there's plenty of precedents to show that if we understand the biology of underlying biology of a particular trait, then we can increase multiple traits at one time. And that's no less true for nutrient profiles of our crops. So I'll give here a nice example from Simmet, where they've developed a wheat containing 20% more zinc than average in the grain. And that because it's been bred very specifically for using QTL that do not decrease yield, you get both things, a high yielding crop with high zinc content. And for me, that is the challenge that we face now, to use biological understanding to say, we're going to lift all of these things together. Not to say it's not a challenge, but we do have precedents to show that it's possible. Next slide, please. We also have a precedent, a kind of a framework to say how we're going to do it. So on the left of the slide there, you see a biochemical pathway. In this case, this is starch synthesis. And through that kind of understanding of biology, we can say, okay, if we want to produce crops with lower glycemic index, then perhaps we could change the structure of starch by knocking out certain enzymes or taking natural allelic variation. And we can use that to set ourselves a hypothesis for how we achieve a nutritional goal. And you see the group of people eating diverse foods there. Well, they're the people who should set those nutritional goals. So within each target environment for our genetics and breeding, it's got to be shaped around the diets and the cultures of those environments. So to give you a very simplistic example, bread in Western Europe is leaven bread. It's the risen type of bread with yeast that we talk about a lot. Whereas say in India or North Africa, it's generally flat bread. And those differences in food functionality, old-fashioned food science, are really important for the way that we might manipulate the nutritional content and still deliver those food products that are the preferred in those societies. Another great example of that is in terms of social sciences and interaction with social science, why, although we know that wholemeal bread is definitely better for you than white bread, wholemeal bread figures in the UK, for example, stubbornly remain the same. So if we want to improve the nutritional quality of bread, one argument, for example, that would be made by colleagues at Rothamsted, Peter Shewry and Alison Lovegrove would be, well, let's improve the nutritional quality of the white endosperm, the white part of the flour. So really targeted research to say, let's make the differences where they matter. Then moving to the natural and induced variation, you see I've got a nice legume collection there from the JSC Gene Bank. And the point here is that those selections that have been made historically are really for the traits that mattered way back, and that was really yield and disease resistance. There's a huge amount of diversity for nutritional components of our crops, which is untapped in our gene banks. There's also the new technology of gene editing, which means we can use the information of biochemical pathways, etc., and precisely make modifications to specific genes, which will alter the nutritional quality of our food. Finally, we move across to the combination of field genetics and gene discovery. It's very important that we make these discoveries in realistic agricultural platforms, and we identify the genes controlling these important traits. In this example, I'm showing you soluble fiber content in white flour, collaboration between myself and Rothamsted to identify new high fiber genes in white flour that we've then validated in breeding. We've shown that they can be used in breeding to increase the fiber content of bread, and then they're delivered hopefully to the consumer. So I say there's a cycle there that works, and all we need to do is supercharge it. So my next slides are about how we might do that. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is one recent example of exactly how you can make a step change in that cycle of delivery of useful things to consumers. There's a landrace collection held by the John Innes Centre, curated by the John Innes Centre, called the Watkins Wheat Landrace Collection. We collaborated with the Agricultural Genomics Institute of Shenzhen to produce the complete genome sequence of that entire collection. And in the principal component plot on the left, you see the brown dots. That is a representation of modern wheat. So the most diverse panel of modern wheat we could find and sequence it. Then all the other colors are the Watkins land races. And what that tells you is that modern wheat breeding, and this is true for most other species, tapped into a very limited amount of the diversity available. And now, instead of just hand waving about that and saying, yeah, landrace collections, etc., are very diverse, we've absolutely got a handle on what that diversity is. And it's relatively trivial then to put that together with phenotypic data. Again, in this case, as part of the BBSRC Designing Future Wheat program, in collaboration with Rothamsted and the University of Bristol, we phenotyped for zinc and iron content. And in this case, I'm showing you the signals created by new genetic variants controlling zinc content. So these are kind of step changes I think we need to put in place. Sequencing is kind of generic. All traits benefit from this. But what can we do to specifically target nutrition to, as I say, step up? Next slide, please.
You've had 10 minutes, Simon.
Okay, it's not long now. Okay, so those traits like yield, what do you need to do to get the phenotype? You just run a combine harvester from it, and a signal goes from the combine to the field station, and you can run that type of QTL analysis immediately. Whereas nutritional research is much, much more complex. You often have to mill, fractionate, you have to do low throughput biochemistry. I forgot to say here, expensive. You need to cook it in some way, in a realistic way, to test it in humans, interact with people to conduct human trials. And it is this cycle, next slide, please, which I believe really requires a new impetus from the community, because it's actually this which is a bottleneck for the discovery of the genes that we really need to get into farmers' fields. Next slide, please. The final barrier I'm going to talk about is market failure. In DFW, we have something called the Breeders' Toolkit, and we meet with all the commercial breeders to move our genes into commercial germplasm. And the problem with the value chain, this is for wheat, but I think we have similar examples in all the commodity value chains, is the supermarkets, the manufacturers, the millers will not pay farmers for increased nutritional quality. So of course, breeders say to us, we'd love to do that, but we can't because no one will pay us for it. This is the problem we have. And with breeding being a 20-year cycle, it means that current market failure is having downstream consequences that will take a long time to fix. So do we wait for that pull to increase to a level where breeders can take it, or do we try to intervene from a public research funding point of view? Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. So I suggest that we use mechanisms for pre-breeding to pump prime those discoveries of genes of nutritional impact. This is the Breeders' Toolkit, which is a huge success in DFW for identifying genes for disease resistance and yield improvement. And I think that the way to possibly get around that problem of market failure is to feed into pre-breeding networks at this point, so at least we get those genes as far as modern elite germplasm that breeders can deploy relatively quickly. Okay, thanks very much, and we progress through the next slides to the end of my talk.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure people will bring up some of these points in the breakout groups that we have. So we've now reached the end of the very brief, probably too brief presentations that we've had from each of the three people, and thank you very much for giving such a stimulating kind of setting the scene. And we're now going to have a brief break whilst you're moved into the breakout groups, where there'll be somebody who kind of helps facilitate and coordinate the discussions that you're going to have. There's 7 breakout groups. You'll be assigned to them. Each breakout group has to deal with one of these questions, and if you obviously go through that quickly, you can move on to a second question of choice. But please deal with the question you're asked to, because we're trying to feed back on 3 points to the United Nations, and therefore we don't want 7 groups discussing the same question. Louisa, is it okay if people come back at 25 past to just shift the program by 5 minutes to allow a bit of moving around?
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay, so if people could come back by 25 past, you don't need to do anything. Don't unhook yourself from Zoom here. Turn the camera off if you're going to go and have a quick break or whatever, and then you're going to be assigned to a breakout group where we've allowed 45 minutes, which is a decent amount of time for conversation. So you should really be able to unpack the question extensively, which is what we want. So and focusing in on research and innovation as against other things. So Louisa, okay, so 25 past, if everybody could be ready to be sitting in their breakout room then. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks again to the speakers.
we have everyone back now, Guy.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I mean, one thing you learn in the last 15 months is even when you think you've got all the gremlins of Zoom sorted, they can come and haunt you at any time. So I know some people had quite a wait there, and Barbara certainly had a challenging time when a group trebled in a moment of seconds. So well, thank you, everybody. So I mean, I'm afraid we're going to kind of keep going because of the time pressures that we're under, and hopefully everyone can kind of appreciate why we're doing that. What we want to do now is we're going to get each of the chairs of your breakout groups to contribute to a discussion in which we have on each of these 3 topics. So we're going to have about 15 minutes or so on each of the topics we want to cover, and then at the end of that we'll discuss what's going to happen next. But before I do that, if I can just introduce the 4 chairs who helped us, as well as 3 speakers earlier. So Barbara Bray, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself to the wider group?
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Barbara Bray. I'm a food safety and nutrition consultant working with mainly SMEs in the food industry, helping people with food safety issues and ensuring that they have the right, conforming to the right standards in the UK mainly. And I also work on nutrition from a strategic point of view, so helping people with sustainable nutrition questions and looking at how they can take their portfolio and improve the nutrition quality of their products. I do a lot of work with IFST, the Institute of Food Science and Technology, so chairing meetings, organising, and the same with the Nutrition Society, where I'm a trustee, and also working with the team on chairing and facilitating events as well. So that's me. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Barbara. Maggie Gill.
Hi folks, so I'm Maggie Gill. I'm a retired academic, and in my retirement, so to speak, I get involved in chairing lots of advisory groups, and I chair the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Strategy Advisory Panel for BBSRC, and I also chair the Scottish Science Advisory Council and various other things. So I'm in the fortunate position of not having to go out and look for funding. My background's agriculture. I then expanded out into more generally food systems and environment issues, and globally I've worked quite a lot in relation to developing countries, but also developed countries. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Paul Haggerty. You're on mute, Paul.
So that's not a very good start. I'm Paul Haggerty, Deputy Director of University of Aberdeen Rowett Research Institute of Nutrition and Health. I am the chair of the BBSRC Bioscience for Health strategy panel. I work for Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. Nutrition is my background, and also part of the Action on Stunting Hub, which works in LMICs.
Thank you, Paul. And Laura Pereira.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Laura. I am a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre looking at food system transformations, and also an associate professor at the Global Change Institute at Wits University. And I have a background, looking broadly at sustainability transformations, largely from a food system perspective in the global south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And have also worked quite a bit on looking at food system governance in particular, and how we can bring a systemic approach to actually governing the food system and bringing a variety of different actors together in a transdisciplinary space. Thank
you very much, Laura. So, as I said, there were 7 breakout groups, and we were covering 3 questions. And if we have roughly 15 minutes for each question, we'll start with the first one, which is, what is a healthy, nutritious diet for population and planetary health, of which Paul and Judy were chairing that. And if we could start with perhaps Paul and Judy introducing some of the sort of the key points that they covered in their discussion. So Judy, I don't know if you want to go first. You're on mute. We'll go to Paul because his mic's open, so I can see that. So Paul, do you want to start?
Right. Yeah, I've already made that mistake. So so I'll start. Yeah. So we tried to split this up into various components. So there's a healthy diet for the human population and a healthy diet for the planet. So for the human population, it's nutrient based, and even at the level of nutrients, there isn't a consensus at the moment internationally on what nutrient requirements are. UK requirements differ from EFSA, European countries, FAO, WHO. Some of the differences are minor, but some of them are important. So there is a need for research in that area to define that better. And that brought in some comments about low income countries versus high income countries in terms of what the problems might be. And some of the interventions from the low income countries came up with things like personalized nutrition. And there's absolutely no reason why that should not be an issue in low income countries as well as high income. So we need to get away from those general assumptions about what's relevant to each. The concept of we don't know what a nutritious diet is totally. We know what nutrient requirements are to avoid deficiencies, but to actually go beyond that, you know, for optimal cognitive development, for example, these are very difficult things. And we need more research on that. So, and then if we go to the planetary health, that's moving away from the nutrients to the foods. We heard a lot about commodities and primary produce like wheat, etc. But we also had a discussion about ultra-processed foods, and that feeds into the whole triple burden issue. That's very important, the increasing urbanization of populations and the need to better utilize urban environments in terms of producing foods. That's very important. The group were very focused on the complexity of the whole system and the way that could be captured. We're talking about AI, possible use of AI to try and capture that complexity and the really big major importance of simplifying messages for people. One of the members raised the point of, we now know that almost everybody knows about the environmental impact of animal produce, but they don't make the connection with dairy, whereas, you know, that's just as valid. So there's a lot of complexity there that we have to simplify, and it's really the consumer choice is very important, and we have to make sure that is completely informed. So that's about a million things. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, Paul. And before I go to Judy, I mean, what was there an area which kind of got quite a lot of disagreement amongst your group?
Disagreement, I wouldn't say so, because there was such a friendly bunch.
Okay, and okay, if they were a friendly bunch, I presume nobody wanted to be the Director General for the day. But did you get anybody sort of saying what big change could happen?
Yes, we did. I put them all on the spot and said one after the other they had to be Director General, and some stepped forward to that one. And that was where some of the ideas about thinking about the urban environment came out in terms of production there, and thinking about how we dealt with that, and also the ability to work out the cost, the cost to the planet of the choices that we're making, and the difficulty of doing that.
Okay. And Judy, your group.
Yes, apologies, I had some problems just then. I think we covered similar sorts of areas to what Paul went through, but I think we started off by talking about the lack of granularity. So we've got messages like 5 a day, but we don't always articulate what that means in practice for different people, and the fact that it's not 5 bananas a day. I think we had quite a bit of discussion about the often disconnect between nutrition and all of these other big areas in this space, and the fact that nutrition is fundamentally important for human health, and we really need to make sure that it's got more of a centre stage position in these discussions in order to avoid unintended consequences down the line. We talked about the fact that very few of our current guidelines about fibre and salt and 5 a day, etc., are being met, certainly in a UK perspective. And we need to better understand the gap between people's knowledge and understanding and their practice to try and work out how we can actually help people make that shift. And towards the end, we talked about the one big success story in terms of turning around population health, which was in Finland back in the, I think, 1980s, where there was sort of a countrywide program which facilitated real change in terms of cardiovascular risk. But we recognise that to do that probably worked in Finland because of the type of country Finland is, but we can't assume that it would work elsewhere. And that although the problems are global, the solutions may well have to be defined by current diets and current practices and cultures, etc., in individual countries, and sort of tailor-made to that. One of the members made the point that plant-based diets don't feature that broadly for many people in the population. It's more likely to be people who eat a lot of plant-based foods or plant-derived foods are more likely to have more disposable income and be able in a better place to make choices. Moving through the questions, we talked a lot about the fact that we really can't afford to be siloed in the way that we approach these things, and we need to, most of us have been trained to look at these things in quite a reductionist sort of way, but in fact we need a real systems approach and make use of big data and the tools that are now available to try and identify solutions going forward. So different type of research, different type of, we didn't talk too much about funding, but it did come up, different sort of way of funding research so that we get real multidisciplinary approach. And then we talked about the need to really set, this was in, I think, the third one, which the one that referred to the director being Director General for the day, and the need to have a real clear question. And we like the point that you'd made, Guy, early on about if we can fix this system, it'll have beneficial knock-on effects for other issues that we're trying to grapple with. We talked a little bit about how technology is already being applied that can have beneficial effects, such as reducing the amount of water that's needed in processing. And really like some of the comments made in the third speaker's talk about the need to get buy-in from farmers if we're going to change the types of foods that we're producing. So it's no good having healthy products if nobody wants to eat them, buy them. I think that is probably most of the additional things.
Any of the other chairs of the other groups, anything to add what's been said, or did they cover this question at all in their groups? No. So Judy and Paul, I mean, finally, I mean, did you kind of have a discussion at all about what success looks like? You know, what we could measure in terms of actually research doing.
We talked about that a little bit. So on the one hand, I think we felt that it would be really good to have an index that integrated, if you like, human health and planetary health into one place, and bringing in the social and economic aspects as well. But whether that would ever be achievable is another question. But certainly in terms of health, we talked about being able to use things that are relatively easy to monitor and short-term, like body weight, blood pressure, things that could be measured in primary care that could be useful measures. Also using things like the National Diet and Nutrition Survey to measure changes in dietary patterns in relation to national dietary guidelines such as the Eat Well Guide, and potentially also using some blood-related biochemical markers to assess health. And then ultimately, of course, it would be the health of the population and mortality rates and those sorts of things. And then having, if not an integrated index for planetary health, having some evidence-based markers of planetary health around not just greenhouse gas emissions, which is one that's used very heavily, but also water usage, land usage, those other ones. Okay. So like a battery of measures, but ideally we'd like to see one integrated index, okay, evidence-based.
Thanks. And Paul?
Basically the same as Judy's reporting there, but we didn't frame it in exactly that question, but it was implicit in the discussion. It was really about the complexity of the balance and the trade-off. And you asked earlier about were there any conflicts. The only conflict was really along disciplinary grounds. There were some people that were very focused on planetary health, and there are others that were focused on human health. And it's easy to see where those tensions are when they come together. But I guess the success, the group agreed that the success would be in understanding the complexity and being able to move forward in both those areas, which would be improvements in human health and addressing climate change.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. And so now timing's perfect now, so we can move on to the second question, which was linkages between agriculture and health research, which is kind of taking on some of the things we've been discussing here to produce an affordable, accessible and nutritious diet for all that is sustainable in a changing environment. That's no mean feat to do that. And we've got 3 groups discuss this very big question. So if we could go to Laura first, please.
Sure, thanks. So sort of, I think the main take home from our group was sort of the need to emphasize an interdisciplinary approach. So I think we sort of understand that, but also we also need to start moving more into a transdisciplinary space and really think about co-designing the research that we do with the actors that actually need to be taking up this research. So whether that's governments, whether it's seed companies, whether it's farmers, whether it's supermarkets, so like really actually doing work with the people that need to be using the research at the end of the day, and then getting them to also help us design the kinds of questions that are going to be most relevant for them to be able to take up. So I think that was kind of an overarching discussion that we had in this kind of interdisciplinary space, is that move more to transdisciplinarity. There was also a really big emphasis on the important role of social scientists, particularly in that space, in that dialogue, sort of bringing in co-design. How do you actually do research that addresses kind of the power dynamics of working with different actors across the chain, etc. So the importance of having social science embedded within that as a part of the interdisciplinary process. So yeah, having input from people who are going to be end users, and And then there was another interesting angle to actually sort of really make use of data science and sort of big data, and to actually move a little bit more into that space as we start working with partners, and also the potential for crowdsourcing data that could be important in that space. Some of the divergences and trade-offs that was really emphasized from an economic resilience perspective, that there's quite often a big trade-off between sort of potentially maintaining environmental sustainability and sort of economic benefits and the nutritional quality of food. And so supporting economic sustainability and livelihoods as a really big, and affordability is probably the biggest sort of question mark in terms of the science or the research that we were seeing that needed to be worked on. And that also, and this also goes a little bit later on to the metrics that when you were actually doing this truly interdisciplinary work, sort of bridging from nutrition through to environmental sustainability, there might be some win-wins, and we can find those, but there might also be some trade-offs that where you can do well for the environment, but you're not necessarily getting benefits from a health perspective or a nutrition perspective as you're looking at different breeds, or you're looking at sort of drought adaptability. So to be able to actually just provide that information and be very clear and transparent in terms of what those trade-offs are. So the Director General question, we did have some comments in the chat. I think probably the biggest take home from that was actually about making all data coming from research truly open and fair. So findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. That's particularly an issue for research that spans disciplines, but also that spans continents and countries, and sort of looking at data access and the ability of not just researchers in particularly LMICs to be able to access data and information, but also the users being able to access that, and to really sort of be able to leverage the UN's power to be able to do that. And in particular, also there was a second point to that, which was be able to really make an important issue of food system transformation with national governments as these key sort of input areas and partners that we need to be working with if we're actually going to be able to translate this research into actual action and uptake. So that was sort of the second big Director General point. And then finally, in terms of being successful, there was a lot of discussion on actual uptake and accessibility of the research to these stakeholders, to these users, as being a really important metric that we need to be looking at. So not just how are we producing the research, but like how is it being used and what is the uptake of it? Whether it's farmers being able to have access to sort of improved seeds, or whether it's companies being able to sort of disseminate the different products, what is that uptake? Again, sort of that need to identify those win-wins when we're looking at, for example, regenerative agriculture that also gives us nutrition wins, or climate adaptive breeds that also have sort of cultural wins, for example, and that are particularly economically viable. And then also something that I think was starting to emerge in the chat was this need to move away from focusing on nutrients to nutrition, or to actual food. And I think that was another important discussion that we started to have there. And then finally, that sort of good co-creation can also be a measure of success in and of itself.
Brilliant, thank you. And keep the chat going. The chat is a bit like the coffee room discussion, you know, so it's kind of just keep it there and we'll capture that later, but I won't be able to bring it all in here. But Maggie, over to you next.
Okay, thanks very much. And actually, we had quite a lot of read across to what Laura's just said, which is good in showing how some things are sort of changing across a wider group. So starting with question 1, we had sort of 2 different approaches to how to improve interdisciplinarity. And one side came from starting with the outcome focus. And again, like Laura's group, thinking about co-design with stakeholders. But also perhaps a slightly different one of using foresight. And it's interesting that foresight was maybe 10 years ago used a lot in terms of driving food system change, perhaps maybe too much. There's huge reports and sub-reports and all sorts of things on foresight. And maybe looking back at what happened with some of those. But, you know, again, maybe it is worth going back and looking about some things that may have been missed from those, given the volume of data and words that were there from that. And then another sort of angle on that was one of our group members looking from the data side and having a data tool and sort of looking proactively, going out from that and seeing who would like to be involved in taking that forward, looking for how that tool could actually help to solve some of the bigger problems. So those were different sort of approaches from looking for from that sort of outcome side. And then the other approach that came up was talking about putting teams together. And we had a bit of talk about the sandpit approach, which if people are not familiar with, that is where BBSRC, I think, are the ones who championed that at the start. And it's where scientists express interest in something, they're brought together, and then in a sort of, in the past, in a 2 or 3 day meeting, then you together as groups and turned yourselves into project teams to address something. But another approach that was also talked about was putting together teams through networks. And that's a much longer term. I've certainly been in meetings, there's been a lot of talk about that recently, but of course it takes a long time. So to develop new networks where we're looking at some of these things. So I think and we don't have a lot of time, as we know. So it is about how can we effectively improve some of that networking or build on networks that exist. And there was mention, and I'll come back to that, of CEREC and DRINC actually as good examples of things. DRINC being DRINC, for those who are not familiar with it, just in case anyone gets a misunderstanding of my pronunciation there. But some of those things that have been used in the past. So we're not starting from zero. Let's learn the lessons from what has worked and build on them. So that's from the first question. On the second question, trade-offs and how to manage them. Well, we referred back to what a number of the speakers had said about trade-offs and certainly about how the nutritional value of livestock food, livestock products in terms of human nutrition, but then the big negatives in terms of the environment. And one of the things that came up two things that came up in relation to that. I think we had quite a good agreement across the group on the dangers of using global averages and where that drives certain things. And I think that came up in some of Laura's feedback as well, that it's too easy just to say, to forget that there's different systems, different cultures, different ecosystems across the world. And you cannot just take some of these numbers about how much water livestock use or how much land or whatever else. You need to apply it to your actual locality. And I think Laura also mentioned that in relation to lots of these developing countries know what they want. I mean, there are the nationally determined contributions. A lot of those are in the public domain as to what countries want investment in to help transform their food systems. But aid agencies and places like the World Bank often start from a particular direction. And at the moment, with the Food Systems Summit, I gather there's a lot of talk about endorsing the Eat Lancet Summit, the Eat Lancet outcomes, and those as the diets. And they are way out of line with what certain countries want. So I think there is a danger we flagged in there. Question 3 on the Director General. Yes, we had a lot of people who did not want to be Director General of the UN. That was not their career ambition in terms of this, but they still wanted to make points on this. So I think what came out was the need for more research on power relationships. And that was highlighted by a publication that came out last year, which was it's from Wageningen and indeed from IFPRI, the CGIAR program on food nutrition, which did a systematic review and found there had been very little research on how to actually enable smaller food, certainly things like SMEs. How do you put them, how can you help them negotiate in terms of against the power of the big multinationals? So there's an issue in there. Economics, that is an actual major driver in terms of this, and the price of food affordability's come up before, but are we looking wide enough sort of outside the box of the disciplines that need to be particularly involved? We've heard about social science. I've heard less about economics in the feedback so far. And that, frankly, in terms of food systems, it's economics, and economic systems are major drivers. And unless we do something about that, where are we actually going? We talked about the difference between developed and developing countries. Is it a need for education? Is it awareness? Is it the affordability of food? All those sorts of issues came up. And the gap between knowledge and understanding was a particular point that was raised. Okay, so moving on then to question 4. Well, we sort of addressed this a bit tangentially about how do we measure success. So we started talking more about impact and what has been useful in terms of getting people to think about outcomes and impact. And there was a sort of negativity towards the ref in terms of that was driving towards game playing in terms of trying to count up the numbers, get good marks through the ref from that, whereas things like drink and things like SARIC as networks that help people to understand exactly what they were trying to achieve. If we're thinking about this agriculture and health and through into incomes, impacts at global level, and also very importantly, the need to interact with the private sector. So it was not directly in terms of measures of success, but if you translate it into that, then it is the sort of partnerships that you have. Can you get that interest from the private sector or from the stakeholders in the research questions that you're actually asking? So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much. Nafis.
Thank you. Let me start off with the Director General question, because we got a one of our group came up with a intervention or an area where we could do a lot and we could even measure it, and that is a Manhattan type project on reducing food loss and waste. Huge issue. If we could address that properly, then we could measure it. It would have a huge impact and it could be done hopefully in a relatively short time scale. So that was the starter for 10 in terms of if you were a director to reduce food loss. On the issue of interdisciplinary research, there was an interesting discussion about this. I mean, this has been around for a long time, this issue. And how do we address it? Now, the obvious points around taking a systems approach came up. The fact that it was a journey where you had people with different expertise in different domains coming together, not speaking the same language, and needing the time to actually understand what they're where they're coming from, and that is where funders become important. So BBSRC and others setting out programs, new cause, which requires different disciplinary groups to come together to address a challenge is hugely important. So that was one thing. There was a point made about mobility, staff mobility. And the fact that a lot of people spend most of their careers not only in one discipline but in one institution, and it would be good to encourage a little bit more mobility. We had an interesting discussion about trade-offs. There was a view that there's always going to be trade-offs, particularly in temperate climate. So if you want a nutritious diet, then that will require food coming from different areas of the world, perhaps, and in which case there's a tension between sustainability and having that nutritious diet. And the question might be was that particular food or was that particular commodity grown sustainably in the place from where it came? Other options where research could come in developing that sustainability dimension might be through things like sustainable farming. In terms of interventions to between agriculture and getting these health outcomes, one of the things that we need to recognize, and this came up in the previous conversations, is the power of the private sector, and in particular, the role of supermarkets and the increasing role of supermarkets in developing countries. So one of the issues about food choice is to some extent academic, because a lot of supermarkets drive choice of consumers. And we have an opportunity in many developing countries where these modern food industry firms are beginning to establish a footprint and develop, where we can work much more closely with supermarkets, going back to what I was saying before, develop value chains, etc., with the right kinds of dimensions and the right directionalities, has been said. I did raise the issue of the economic dimensions, but we really didn't delve into that, because a lot of BBSRC activity work is about the nutrition side or the biotechnology side, but it doesn't often bring the economic dimension, has been mentioned. At the end of the day, one of the biggest problems that we have in many developing countries is not the absence of nutritious food, it's access and affordability, which is the key issue. So how do we address the economics of production so that the poorest people can access healthy foods? I think that is one of the biggest challenges. So yeah, a very interesting discussion. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you, Nafis. So we'll move on to the last session now. So that was what is the role of research and innovation in improving the nutritional quality of food in a changing environment? We have two groups who are looking at that, and if I could start with Barbara.
Hi, thank you very much to the group. The group had a fabulous discussion. I'm not saying that, Guy, because you were in it, but we had plenty of voices, not all agreeing. And I think that was really interesting, because we had a genuinely multidisciplinary group. People were coming at things from different angles. One thing that we did agree on from the very get-go is when you're looking at improving nutritional quality of food, it has to be done in context. So obviously we've got the whole piece around the changing environment, but what we realized very quickly is that just improving the nutritional quality of food doesn't solve a problem in itself. It has to be done in context with everything else. So we were looking at breeding programs and saying, well, yes, you can have research in there, but if we don't know that consumers are going to eat the end product, then you've then wasted all of that research. So we should be really looking at the whole consumer insights and going into research that looks at that side of it before we start something that's got a much longer time frame, which just to make sure it's going to have the impact it should. Then similarly with other groups who've gone before, the need to connect nutrition research with primary agriculture, because we felt that there was a gap there. So that would really be helpful in designing, and people have talked already about co-designing projects. It's best to do it across a few disciplines, and nutrition and primary production is one of them. Socioeconomics came up as well in our group, like it has done with all the others, and particularly important, we thought, for the grand challenges is looking at the socioeconomics, because a few people have said in the chat and in their sessions that if accessibility and affordability is an issue, then improving the nutritional quality, again, doesn't solve that problem. And there was a missing middle, so what happens to nutrition of a crop or a product throughout the food production side. So if you're going to alter, you might be able to improve the quality from a breeding point of view, either from livestock or crops, but what happens to it further downstream? So the food technology and food science research comes into it. And then finally, one last piece, which I suppose talks to what I've just said on the socioeconomic groups, specifically looking at where we can improve the level of research around vulnerable and hard to reach groups. So having co-designed research or citizen science approaches that focus on those groups who traditionally have been left out of research projects. So having low agency interventions and enabling people to make changes. So those were the things that globally we thought would be helpful. And we did talk around quite a few other topics as well, but they've already been mentioned. In terms of divergences and trade-offs, this is where my group came into its own, because there were quite a few divergences and trade-offs that we wanted to get our teeth into. And it was about, you know, what are we trading off with each other? So for example, is it mutually exclusive to have really high quality of crop production and get good quality for human nutrition and have a minimal impact on the environment? There are just so many factors to look at, and we realised that there was going to have to be a compromise. So it didn't matter which factor you looked at, you're going to have to just try and level out across all of a few. So it meant that you don't achieve the optimum in any one particular thing. So we felt that there were going to be trade-offs, and it's just unfortunate that if you want to try and get the best overall result, then you're going to have to reduce the expectation in some areas. We also looked at market forces, so there are the trade-offs there. You know, if the consumer isn't willing to pay extra, then what other incentives do you have to put in to nudge them? So that's obviously with consumers who can afford to pay for food, as opposed to the ones who are being priced out of the market. Other things we looked at was the crop varieties. So if you're focusing on a crop variety, you don't always get the environmental impact that you want. And we had a huge debate on the chat about people tend to make assumptions that organic might be more nutritious, or regenerative agriculture produces a certain feature. And it's about saying, well, it's not one or the other, it's trying to find that compromise. When it came to the DG question for the UN, there was a bit less enthusiasm, but one of the things that did come out of that was having energy efficient cold chains and a good post-harvest supply chain, so that it doesn't matter what the farmer's doing, however much invested they are in producing a really good quality crop or healthy livestock. If you then don't have the downstream post-harvest management, you lose a lot of that food. So using the DG of the UN to mobilize all the relevant people to get stuck into that project and improve that would be really good. And then the whole theme around stakeholders and bringing them together came up in another comment we had about being the DG, whereas if you were to get all the stakeholders across different countries together, you could find out ways in which to increase high quality and nutritious food in people's food environments. So really that was just a quick look at that particular question. Then I ended with a question about the evaluation. So how would it be possible to tell if all of the actions that we thought about were successful? And this went back to the first question at the top of the hour when we talked about having a multidisciplinary approach, because you need to include all of these different factors when you're talking about nutritional quality, all these different disciplines. And it's the same when you're measuring the results. You don't just want to look at nutrition status, you also want to look at the impact on environmental health, or you want to look at the social and environmental impacts on the population, biological life cycle analysis. There's a whole range of things that we'd have to measure to say, well, we've actually achieved our success point or not. So again, I've left out quite a few bits, but they've already been covered by several other groups. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Barbara. And that final group was led by Simon.
Thanks a lot. So I think my notes are a bit too chaotic to follow this specific question. So if you just bear with me, I'll go through my points as they occurred in the meeting, really. So I think we had strong support for this network idea. So we've seen great evidence of them working in other areas of research, and on that research focus, there's clearly these great centers of research for the multidisciplinary areas we talked about, and knitting them together with a network type structure, we all agreed was an idea that would clearly be productive for the efficiency of the research and what was possible within the research. So strong support for that. Also this idea of granularity. So what are our targets? So in terms of research, really defining the targets, because we've got a detailed idea of what to go for, and the current situation could certainly be improved. Then we said, well, because of the different way those disciplines work, there's some technical things that would be interesting for further development. And this is this idea of, trying to get a balance between the things that might be used for industry standards compared to the type of measurements you might want to take for research. And a few of us had personal experience of the walls being quite low in this regard. If you actually approach those questions, they can be tackled. So that's a technological question. The trade-offs we talked about were the classic ones: yield versus nutrition, taste versus nutrition. And I don't think we really came up with answers to that. But again, I've heard the things about a kind of an index which tries to capture the overall value at the end of the food chain, which sounds like a good solution for that. Then we really came into something which was a big area, which I think is about smart strategic directions for the questions we take on and the way we take them on. So, and that came to a kind of climax in the discussion with the whole thing of a plant-based diet, to the extent where if your research is on meat production at the moment, you might feel almost under attack that, you know, just give up on your research because the move has to be towards a plant-based diet, when in fact it's far more nuanced than that. If anything, several of the trends in the global trends are going to be wealthier societies, more meat being eaten. So just to, you know, if that's how it's going to be, think about the kind of research we have to do in terms of adaptation, etc., and mitigation to make that, to reduce the penalties associated with that trend. The same question, another part of that point was, you know, what do people eat? The whole point of nutrition education and the fact that so often that isn't something that leads to a change in the behavior of societies. So look for those areas for the foods people do eat, for the way they do behave, and then trying to shape the research to fit in with that, not to swim against it. We also came up with this idea of, well, you know, how far down the line can you go over time with where things are going to be accessible when they're needed. So we came up with this idea of democratizing genetics. So taking the materials that we have down the pipeline far enough so it is as accessible as possible. There's going to be these problems which might seem insurmountable now in terms of adoption, education, market failure, etc. But you've at least got to take them as far as you can, so that that part of the, you know, the team has done their job. We had some great examples of people talking about, you know, real life examples of how it really works. So people involved with trials and human efficacy trials, getting very involved with the work and interested in the outcomes, but when the trial's over, moving right back to the previous, to their previous diets, for example. So just how much of a insurmountable barrier that can be. Oh, another point, sorry, I forgot to make on the networks is remembering the neglected parts, the areas that seem to be consistently neglected, although today it hasn't been, for example, storage and forward supply and the role that can play. And I think we had a lot of concurrence with what's come across from the other groups, so I don't need to speak too long. But I think they were our big messages, the kind of the networks and going with the flow, you know, what's going to work. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very, very much. And we're absolutely on time at the moment. And there's been an incredible rich discussion and probably some of the more kind of agreements and disagreements, etc., and agreeing to not agree in the chat line along the side, which I think is very, very rich for the debate that we're capturing here. And it's just up to me now in the closing minutes just to summarize a few things and then talk about what happens next. So, I mean, what's been fascinating to me, I mean, I've heard somebody even talk about the Manhattan Project, but I know from discussions in government, there was a phase with a certain person who's no longer quite so favoured in government about moon landing type projects. The research agency is going to exist, and there has been discussion about in our world, what is the moon landing project? What is the project which captures the imagination of a political leader, which potentially can be quite transformational in its own right? I read in the line here, some people saying, oh, the problem with all this system stuff is you perhaps sometimes miss out on moving one lever dramatically, and sometimes that's easier to do. So, you know, what is a moon landing or a Manhattan Project? And it was quite interesting, that one about reducing food loss and waste. What's also very obvious is it's quite easy to understand why there hasn't been a golden bullet or silver bullet, and probably not likely to be, because the complexity of what we're dealing with is quite phenomenal. I mean, we are dealing with a very, very complex system and a very wicked and challenging problem. And the combination of those two certainly make it very difficult. And it comes back to perhaps what one people say, you know, should we try to boil the ocean on this? Or should we focus in on very specific things which we can really get to grips with at pace if necessary and deliver, but whilst also understanding the importance of putting that into the bigger picture? It's a bit like the concept of an interdisciplinary PhD project. Is it better for that student to have quite strong disciplinary training, but with an interdisciplinary kind of lens at times? Or is it better for them to have a chapter on 5 or 6 different disciplines? And that's a kind of a big debate. But the question here is, you know, we're not talking about everybody doing everything systems, but we could be talking about making big breakthroughs on something, but actually understanding that if you do X and you don't understand the socioeconomics or the cultural aspects, nothing will change. One of the biggest things I ever heard was a development project creating a crop which could cope with a situation. No anthropologists and social scientists involved. The crop was an incredible success scientifically, but didn't deliver any development gains because it was one of the few crops that was grown by males in that region, and improving the income of the male farmers was not going to improve any of the things in terms of children in education and a whole variety of aspects. And it was about the only crop they could have done in which that had been the case. But nobody spoke to the anthropologists, etc., about, you know, what's the best crops to work on. So that complexity, you know, is there, but we need to kind of work our way through it. I suppose the saving grace here is that the reward is so high and the opportunity perhaps never so present. I mean, we knew before the COVID pandemic that non-communicable diseases had become the biggest health factor. And we know the implications of generating food that it has on the planetary health too. And even with COVID, what it is demonstrated is the links to non-communicable disease and the links to food in multiple ways. So I do think that there's a door that's been partially opened amongst senior leaders right across the world, and it takes perhaps one of them to grab the imagination of the Manhattan Project or the moon landing or whatever, to try to capture something which is very big to them, but behind that lots of other things can follow. Certainly within the UK, the upcoming National Food Strategy is going to make a series of recommendations which potentially talk to much of what we've been saying here, and various requests in terms of what role research and innovation may have on that, and that is promising. And I think that hopefully the same will be true right across the world. So I do think that the conversation we've been having, you know, that people are listening and people are wanting us to come up with a kind of a route ahead, a roadmap. Maggie mentioned foresight. I think foresight has got a little bit more attractive again in government after the you know, the closing down of the foresight team in the Government Office of Science, but there is a bit more interest in that now, and I think that may will continue. So what's going to happen here is the BBSRC team are going to summarize all the information that we have and produce it into the template that is required, that feeds into the United Nations international dialogues, and then they will make that available to you to see when it's been produced. I'm not too sure about the situation of further consultation because it would probably take too long with so many people, but I'll leave Louisa and the team to kind of talk to anybody who wants specifically more information about that. That information will then feed into, as I said, to the United Nations, and then even if the United Nations Food Systems Summit is a kind of one of these mass jamborees, it's very hard for us to get traction on. then the really key thing, and I think the thing that's really good here, is that the discussion that we're having will feed into UKRI, and in the programme that I'm looking after, it'll feed into that. And if the National Food Strategy and some of its recommendations come to fruition, it will feed into that. So that the conversation has multiple endpoints, the UN being the one we are immediately targeting, but beyond that, there are loads of things within the UKRI that we hopefully can do. So thanks everybody for participating. We still have 85 people listening X hours later, which is always a good sign. And thank you to the team for organising it so well. And thank you to that team for staying so calm when something like 50 people had been ignored by Zoom breakout and you're desperately trying to put everyone in room by room. So thank you, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed the afternoon as much as I have. Thank you.
Thank you.